Despite reaching the status of Yonko at this point in the timeline, Monkey D. Luffy's journey to becoming the Pirate King is paved with regrets and painful loss. But what if Luffy had a second chance? In today's video, we'll explore what would happen if Luffy was reborn with his memories and powers. Our story begins in the original timeline, where Luffy is facing off against Kaido. True to the story, Luffy awakens Gear 5 and the abilities that come along with it. But this time, his battle against the world's strongest beast gets drawn out a bit too long. We know that using Gear 5 completely drains Luffy of his energy, and in this timeline, he completely loses track of his limits the first time he accesses Nika's powers. This means that Luffy simply runs out of life force before he can transform back into his base state. But the Hito Hito no Mi Maro Nika isn't a devil fruit that would let its destined user die so easily. Using the power of the Sun God himself, Luffy's soul is transported back in time and reincarnated in his body at the moment where he eats the Gomu Gomu no Mi. Young Luffy wakes up, and suddenly he's not so young anymore. His mind holds over a decade of experience, and he actually knows all 3 types of Haki. Even though he hasn't mastered Gear 5th, Luffy has managed the awakening of the Nika fruit and has proper mastery of Gear 4. Additionally, he knows every island, every enemy, and every betrayal before it happens. But unfortunately, Luffy can't just go full power from day one, as his 7-year-old body has limits. Since the Straw Hat Captain isn't exactly known for his smarts, Luffy will probably learn this the hard way after damaging his body trying to deliver an armament Haki-infused punch or something like that. However, Luffy is intelligent enough to know about butterfly effects, and realizes that changing too much might make things worse. He has to hide his abilities for the critical moments where he'll deal with his biggest regrets. So initially, Luffy keeps his memories secret, and he relives his childhood with Garp, Dadan, Ace, and Sabo, letting events play out naturally. Fast forward to age 17, and Luffy sets sail from East Blue with his goal of becoming the Pirate King. From the start, everything is different. The first few arcs are incredibly easy, as Luffy has no trouble dealing with Alvida's crew to free Kobe, or fighting off the Marines to release Zoro. But Luffy understands that he can't take the lead and dominate all the enemies, as that would rob his crew of the opportunity to grow. So, while the Orange Town and Syrup Village arcs should be easy wins, Luffy doesn't just one-shot Buggy and Kuro, and draws out the battles without endangering his crew or any civilians. At the Baratier, Don Krieg talks a big game, and even though Luffy could crush him in an instant, he waits for Mihawk to show up, as that's a critical moment for Zoro's development. After Zoro is defeated in his duel, Luffy makes short work of Don Krieg, and they're ready to move on to Arlong Park, where Luffy struggled quite a bit in the original timeline. But this time, Arlong isn't even a serious challenge, and Luffy beats him pretty decisively. By the time the Straw Hats get to Logtown, Luffy faces his first serious problem, his bounty. He'd been trying to downplay his strength all this time without even using Gear 2, but the world government caught on to Luffy's strength. In the original timeline, Luffy left the East Blue with a $30 million bounty, but this time it's over 100 million berries, as the world learns of how easily Luffy defeated the major pirates of the East Blue. The Marines are terrified of him, and Smoker can't believe how this kid had surpassed the bounties of veteran pirates in just a few short weeks. Moving on to the Alabasta Saga, most of this arc is pretty straightforward, as Luffy already knows all about Baroque works. However, he still doesn't reveal his memories and lets things play out just like they did in the original timeline, as he's confident that he can beat Crocodile. And this is actually Luffy's greatest advantage. He knows every opponent's weakness and the strengths of their Devil Fruit abilities. Vivi, Mr. 9, Mr. 5, and Miss Valentine are easily handled by Luffy and his crew, as Robin watches from the shadows, fascinated by this impossibly strong teenager. The Alabasta arc itself gets really interesting because Luffy faces his first major dilemma. In the original, this arc was a proper war with plenty of collateral damage. Luffy could speak to Vivi, stop Crocodile early, and ensure the clash between the rebels and Royal Guard never happens. But that would mean he'd have to reveal his powers much earlier than anticipated. Luffy makes the difficult decision to let the conflict happen, and defeats Crocodile the same way he did in the original timeline. The Skypiea arc happens fast, as Luffy senses Enel's observation Haki, solos his forces, and beats Enel without breaking a sweat. He can actually get away with using close to his full strength here, as Enel is an incredibly tough opponent, and Luffy also has the excuse of his Devil Fruit being a hard counter to Enel's if anyone asks any questions. The Long Ring Long Land arc is a key moment in the storyline, because this is where the Straw Hat crew ends up fighting against Aokiji when he attacks Robin. Originally, Luffy was easily beaten by Aokiji, but he can't let that happen this time, because the Admiral's ice powers are actually life-threatening. So while Luffy is able to send his crew off and hide his powers from them, Aokiji gauges the Straw Hat Captain's strength, as Luffy keeps up with him and counters his Devil Fruit abilities with Haki. Aokiji doesn't do anything too serious here, and eventually backs off, but this encounter means that the world government turns its focus on Luffy much earlier. The Water 7 and any Slavi arcs proceed the same way as they did in the original timeline, and there's nothing much that changes here. Frankie still joins the crew as shipwright, and the Straw Hats rescue Nico Robin. Thriller Bark happens fast as Luffy wrecks Moria and oars with Haki. The crew clears everything out and leaves before Kuma can even arrive. But now we move on to the Summit War saga, and this is the critical moment that Luffy has been preparing for ever since he got reincarnated. Back then, at Marineford, Luffy was nearly able to save Ace without proper Haki mastery or Gear 4, but now he has a bunch of advantages in his fight. Luffy and his allies still storm Impel down, but Luffy doesn't have perfect information on Ace's location, so he only ends up freeing a bunch of convicts while Ace is taken to be executed. Thanks to the efforts of the Whitebeard crew and their allies, Luffy is able to free Ace and bring him to Whitebeard's extra ship. Luffy recalls that this is the point where Akainu makes that fateful provocation, so just as the Fleet Admiral approaches them, Luffy enters Gear 5. Earlier, Ace died trying to shield Luffy from Akainu's Magma Fist, but with Gear 5, Luffy takes on the Fleet Admiral with seemingly no difficulty. Luffy's cartoonish fighting style and the ability to change the nature of anything he touches are too much for the normally serious Akainu, and he's unable to challenge Ace to fight him and defend Whitebeard's honor. But just let that observation sink in. The most traumatic moment in One Piece is erased as Ace returns to Whitebeard. Whitebeard likely still dies of his injuries, but he's surrounded by his crew and happy that he was able to save one of his children, even in his old age. Now, with Ace alive, there's no motivation for the crew to train during the time skip, but Luffy reveals that he's from the future and pushes everyone to go their separate ways. While the others still follow the same training they did in the original timeline, Luffy's time with Rayleigh changes considerably. This time, he's working on stabilizing Gear 5 and making sure that he doesn't run out after just 5 minutes. When the crew reunites, there's one big question. Now that Ace is alive, does he join the Straw Hat crew? It's really unlikely that this happens, as Ace wouldn't want to be Luffy's subordinate. Instead, he joins up with the likes of Marco, Vista, and Thatch to rebuild the Whitebeard crew. Ace being alive also means that the three brothers might reunite when Sabo appears on Dressrosa, and this arc proceeds the same way that it did in the original timeline, with Luffy defeating Doflamingo. The Whole Cake Whole Island saga doesn't change much either in this timeline, as we're now getting closer to the point where Luffy was reincarnated, so all the top tier threats can actually keep up with him. But is that really the case? We see the real change in the battle against Kaido, where this timeline's Luffy died after overexerting himself. He's been training with Rayleigh to perfect this form, and this time Luffy maintains some sense of control over his instincts. So while he still fights with absolute freedom, Luffy doesn't extend the fight unnecessarily, leading to a decisive victory with Kaido and Big Mom losing their titles as emperors. The Egghead arc is where we see the next major change, as Luffy's newfound control over Gear 5 lets him save Vegapunk from being killed by Kizaru. This means Vegapunk's final message isn't broadcast upon his death, and he only reveals his discoveries to the Straw Hats, giving them a strategic advantage in the hunt for the One Piece. Now, we don't know what the final part of Vegapunk's message was, as it's cut short before he can get to the specifics of Joy Boy, but we do know that his survival is bound to heat up the final saga. So what do you think of this timeline? Does Luffy's reincarnation improve his chances of taking down the world government? Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for more incredible One Piece content.